So I want to thank you for being here. We do have InterVarsity Press. I'm in the middle of a trilogy for InterVarsity Press. And Volume 1 was Christianity on Trial. Volume 2 is Atheism on Trial. And then Volume 3 is due out next year, and that's World Religions on Trial. So I'm thankful to InterVarsity Press for putting that out. I'm thankful to Pastor Jarrett and our church for making sure that everyone could get a copy of this. And so we're pretty stoked about the chance that you've got to get a copy. I'll tell you about that more later. But I want to talk to you right now because most of you, look like you're human. And human beings are hardwired for truth. When we find something that's true and real, we grab onto it. And God's truth, as Paul said in Romans, Rabbi Paul taught us that God's truth is all around us in the world. And so even if you don't have a Bible, you can still find truth. 2 + 2 is 4. And that's truth. And that's God's consistency. And we can find truth all around us in the world. And when we do, we grab hold of it. So my question in this book is it true that there is no God? And those who believe that there is no God, if I had them in a courtroom and I were going to cross-examine them, how would I do so? And that's the genesis and the theme behind the book. And I want to introduce you to the book today in hopes that you'll actually read it. And my mom will 5 or 6 times, but I'd like someone other than mom to read the book. I have lived my life in the American court system. In the American court system, courts are based on truth. I'm not a retired lawyer. I still try cases. I'll be in Ohio trying the damage phase of the national opioid case in May. I tried that case with my team in September, October, November of last year, Cleveland, Ohio. This is what I know. And the premise of the American court system is that civilization, after thousands and thousands of years, have determined a system that best answers big, important questions of life. And we are so confident that our court systems will find truth that the court systems can be used to end the life of a human being. The court system can be used to determine which parent is going to get custody of children in a divorce. The court system can be used to determine who ran the red light. We believe in it enough that we stand behind it. And a fair and impartial court system was one of the reasons that the founding fathers gave for establishing our independence from England. King George, they wrote, was depriving the Americans of their right to a fair trial by a jury of their peers. It's a bedrock truth of our country. And I love it, but if it's going to work, if I'm going to put something on trial to you, you as a juror have to be impartial. You can't have these scales tilted. There we go. That's better. You can't have the scales tilted. The first thing you want to get out of jury duty, which you should never want to do, all you have to do is say, oh, I have bias, sympathies, and prejudices that I cannot set aside. And the judge is compelled to remove you. Because she or he must secure a jury that is fair and impartial. Now, why do I tell you this morning? I want to talk about whether or not God exists. And some of you believe God exists. Some of you maybe believe he doesn't exist. There is no God. Some of you may be in the waffle land of, I don't know, I don't care. And some of you may say something along that spectrum. Yes, I believe, but I've got serious fears and doubts about the validity of my faith. Whatever you are, if I'm going to talk to you as a jury right now, I want you to be fair and impartial. So wherever you are on that spectrum, I want you to say, I'm going to try and assess this evidence and give it an opportunity instead of just letting my opinion right now drive the way I read the evidence. Because I think if you do that, if you put atheism on trial in that way, I think you'll find that it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to believe in God. So, people come up to me all the time and they say, hey, Lanier, can you prove there's a God? I was at a dinner party the other night in Charleston, South Carolina, and a couple of trial lawyer buddies were standing around saying to me, you know, one lawyer in particular said to me, he said, I've been watching some of your stuff on the internet. He says, and I don't understand, you've got a joy and a happiness and a relationship, and I don't believe in that there's a God. And it seems to me I'm missing out on a whole lot of life because of that. And in essence, he was saying, would you sit down with me sometime and discuss this? Can you show me there's a God? Because he desperately would love there to be one. And I'm excited to get to do that with him. And I'm looking forward to it. But I want to do that with you right now, and I've got to do 3 things with you. The first thing I want to do is talk to you about what proof is. Because there are misconceptions there. And the second thing I want to do is I want to talk to you about 2 options that we have among the options of what's real in this world. And then the last thing we'll do is look at some of the evidence and get you primed to read the book. All right? By the way, we're not selling the book to you. If you're here visiting, you need to know we don't believe we sell the message of God. I don't get royalties from this book. They're all donated. There is nothing about this that's money making. Now, there will be a lot of our members who can afford to pay for the book, and they know that the money goes back into the ministry of the church. And so you'll see some people saying, I want to pay for this book. But you don't feel obligated to pay for that book at all. We want the book. This is the most important message we can give to people, is there is a God, and he is real, and he loves you and wants to be in a relationship with you. That's nothing we sell. Jesus did not charge for tickets to the Sermon on the Mount. Moses did not descend with the tablets from Sinai and tell people for $1.50 they could look at them. 2 shekels, they could touch them. So that's what we're going to do. Let's start with proof. Proof is wonderful. Proof is something that's ingrained in our brain. We go to school. We learn mathematical proof. And mathematical proof can be very precise. I mean, you can determine that 2 + 2 = 4 by counting. Now, one of our daughters, when our son was young, I would play algebra games with him. He was a young boy. It would keep his mind entertained. Will, if you had 2 apples, and Gracie gave you another apple, and Rachel gave you another apple, how many would you have? And he could say 4. And then I tried it on the next child, Gracie, whose mind isn't as much a computer as Will's. Hers is more a floral arrangement. And beautiful and artistic, but a little different in the way it's wired. And I said to her, Gracie, I was simplifying it, if you have 2 apples and I give you 2, how many would you have? And she said, a whole bunch. And she said, Dad, if you had an apple and I gave you a banana, how many would you have? And I said, I don't know, honey. And she said, you'd have a fruit salad. Mathematical proof is good, but that's just for math. Dr. Schneider's here, my wife's doctor. And he can, all day long, put people through tests to determine if they've got a disease or if they've got an illness. And there's medical tests that you can do. If you've ever done any cooking, you can take measuring cups and you can prove how much flour you're putting in to the cake. You get measuring cups to prove how much of a liquid or a solid there is. You can take a thermometer and use it to prove what the temperature is. But if I want to ask you, can you prove that you love someone? If I say, prove to me you love someone with a thermometer, you're not going to be able to do it. One of the things I'm frequently called to do in a courtroom is to prove someone loves someone else. I tried the first Vioxx case in the country. I represented the widow Ernst. Her husband, Bob Ernst, had taken Vioxx for hand pain and died of a heart attack, myocardial infarction. And the way Vioxx as a drug worked, it was a cyclooxygenase 1 inhibitor. Actually, it was a COX-2 inhibitor so that COX-1 would express itself. Forget all of that for a moment. Suffice it to say, he shouldn't have had the heart attack. But I only can win damages for the widow Ernst if I can prove love between her and her husband. Well, how do you prove that? You don't do it with mathematical formula. You don't do it with measuring cups or thermometers. It doesn't mean we don't prove it. It just means there are different ways to prove different things. And this is important because people who say, prove to me there's a God, are thinking they want me to go onto a science classroom or take a litmus paper and determine whether God's an acid or a base. And that's using a thermometer to tell you how much flour you're putting in a cake. It's the wrong measure of proof. So when we get to a courtroom, a judge in the bastion of American truth finding, the American court system, a judge will tell you proof in a civil case is what is the greater weight of credible evidence. If you've got, I did bring some toys today, and I'm sorry about that, but it's in case things get boring, we'll just break them out. If the judge will tell people, if there's a case to be made, you put all of the evidence in favor of that case in one side of the scales. You put the evidence against that case in the other side of the scales. And you determine which is the greater weight of credible evidence. Proving the existence of God is never a call to someone to have mathematical precision that 2 + 2 = 4. It is, let's take into account all of the evidence that we can. Let's determine how credible that evidence is, and then let's weigh it and see what's more likely than not. And that's what proof is. So when I talk about proving God, I'm not talking about measuring things with a cup. I'm talking about looking at the evidence and determining what's most reasonable to believe. Because ultimately, that's what you're going to do. You're going to believe. You're going to believe one way or the other. So what's the most believable? What's most credible? What has the greater weight of credible evidence? That's proof of those questions that you can't just answer with a tape measure. I get a tape measure. I can prove how far I am from Pastor Jarrett. But I cannot take that tape measure and tell you how cold the water is that I just drank. It's the wrong measuring stick. So that's proof. Now, let's look at options. I want to give you 2 options. Here are your 2 options. Option number 1, and I've got them in black and white because they are as clear as black and white options. Option number 1, there is no God. Option number 2, there's a God. And we can squabble about what kind of God he, she, or it may be, But I'll make it clear to you, I'm talking about the God that has revealed himself to Israel and its people through Abraham, his subsequent progeny, and especially Moses on Sinai. And I'm talking about the God as understood as being expressed in Yeshua, Jesus, who the Christian believes, I believe, is God incarnate. So that's the God I'm going to be using as a model, but that's a different quibble. You want to quibble over that? Read my book, Christianity on Trial. That's not what I'm fussing about here. So here are our options. Let's say there's no God or there is God. Now, I put a globe up there. And I put a globe up there because what I'm really talking about here is the way you view the world and reality. Some people would call it a world view. It's the idea that this is what I believe to be the ultimate truth when we're asking those big questions. Is there a God? Now, a lot of people don't even want to ask the question. If you want to be a philosophical ostrich and just stick your head in the ground, that's fine. But I promise you, at some point in your life, you're going to wish you knew the answers to these questions. And so I urge you to think this through with me. Sense as we work through this. Now, if there's no God, do you know who we are? Do you know who you are? If there's no God, you are a sack of chemicals. That's what you are. You're a bunch of chemicals that are all hanging around together. You got a lot of carbon, got a lot of oxygen, got a lot of hydrogen, got some potassium, I think even some magnesium and phosphorus. I think you've got like 11 chemicals or so in your body. Maybe more, I don't know. But I bet I could name at least 11. And that's what you are. You're a sack of chemicals. Do you know where the chemicals came from? If there's no God, then somehow matter still came to be. And as that matter came to be and exploded into stardust that populated the known universe, which I guess space somehow came to be as well. In the process of that, some of those atoms started sharing electrons and coming together in the form of molecules. And if there's no God, these molecules have somehow made their way into the sacks of chemicals that you and I are today. But we really are just cosmic stardust, and not in any romantic way. So we're sacks of chemicals. Now, if there's no God, what else can we say? Well, we know that some of our chemicals are interacting with each other. The neural synapses in your brain have chemical connection points. The muscles in your body have electrical signals that innervate them. So if there's no God, you and I are a sack of chemicals with some of our chemicals interacting with each other. Well, I hope you're feeling good about yourself right now. Now, let me tell you the third thing we can say. This is a safe assumption. I don't see anybody could dispute either of these points so far. The third thing we can say is that our sack of chemical and electrical interactions differs from other animals. I am always chagrined to inform my daughter Sarah that our dog Tizzy is not one of my children. She says, "Yes, Dad, Tizzy is one of your daughters." I say, "No, Sarah, I will die for my daughters. I ain't dying for Tizzy." There is a difference that we can say. This is why we can not all be vegans, even though we believe there's no God. It's not cannibalism for you to eat the can of tuna. Because the different organisms, we can say, have different chemical interactions. Now, why we value one set of interactions over another is a very debatable point. But that there are differences, I think that's a fair thing to say if there's no God. Now, one of the most difficult things for people who don't believe in God to accept is what happens if we draw a line here and start drawing conclusions from these gimmies. These are gimmies. This is just the way it is. And if you want to draw a line underneath, what conclusions can you and I draw about life's big questions? Well, one of them that I think is necessarily drawn is that there's really nothing that exists that sets up objective right and wrong. In other words, how do you say that one chemical interaction is evil? Take Hitler and Nazism. That's an easy one. I think most everybody says that what Hitler did, exterminating 6 to 8 million Jews, not to count additional people that were deemed genetically inferior, was pure evil, was wrong. Anybody who is of right and sound mind will agree to that. And yet, if all we are sacks of chemicals with interactions, there's not really anything out there that tells us a definition of right and wrong. And I'm not coming up with some new argument here. This is the argument Plato makes when he explains the dialogue between Socrates and Euthyphro. And for those of you too young to have read that dialogue, you get hints of it in a Kanye West song. You do, okay? He's singing about Socrates and bias and which one you buy and anyway, what's right and wrong. But I'm here to tell you that if there's nothing beyond the chemical stardust that we are, then there's nothing saying that's right or that's wrong. Oh, you can say society does, but German society allowed them to exterminate Jews. It is so interesting when the prosecution for Nuremberg came about. There was an American prosecutor who came from our U.S. Supreme Court. There was a British prosecutor and a Russian prosecutor, and they headed up the Nuremberg prosecution. They spent the first 6 months trying to figure out what they were going to prosecute the Nazis for, because they didn't really break any German laws. And what right does England have to tell Germany what their laws should be? So they were really, well, the Russian wasn't struggling. His view was, who's having a trial? Just bring them in, say you're guilty, and shoot them. He really did. But the American and the Brit said, no, we've got a judicial system. We've got to do this fair. But they couldn't figure out how they could indict them. So ultimately, they came up with this concept of crimes against humanity. Well, who decides what those are? The victor in a war? This is a huge issue. Got a friend who's an atheist. I was talking through this with him, and he said, I'm a golden rule atheist. And I said, what does that mean? He says, I live by the golden rule. I said, what golden rule? He says, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. I said, and you're an atheist? He said, yes. I said, well, you're an idiot. And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, how many sharks are swimming around in the ocean with that golden rule? I'm not going to eat this fish because I wouldn't want to be eaten myself. If there's no God to define right and wrong, then you ought to be living for whatever gets you through your day, because there's really no right and wrong. It's a game, a mental game. Now, that's if there's no God. Let's talk about if there is a God. And specifically here, I'm talking about the Jewish Christian God. You look at it from a Jewish perspective, look at it at a Christian perspective. They do not disagree. They are totally in line with one another on this. So it would be called a Judeo-Christian God. That teaches that God exists outside of space and time. Before space and time were even created, there was an infinite, personal, and moral God. Infinite, without limit, in terms of existence, going forward or going backwards. Personal, in that not just a supercomputer, but someone with what we call in human terms personality. Moral, because there are ethical boundaries to this God. This God's truth. This God's not going to tell a lie. This God has a morality. And that is one premise of the Judeo-Christian God. So there's an infinite, personal, and moral God. There's a second one. And that is that humans uniquely bear the image of this moral God. So you and I are hardwired for God's morality. We know what's good and bad, even if we don't want to give credit to it, even if we don't want to live it. You look, we uniquely have been made in his image, and we bear in our essence. We have been programmed with understanding right and wrong. This alternate view of reality also says that we were made to be in relationship with God. We're not an island. There was an old Greek saying, one man or one person, actually I think the saying it was man, sorry, they were misogynists at times. It's on air. One man is no man. It's the same principle. We exist to be in relationships. I dare say there's not one of us who doesn't deep down inside crave the idea of being loved unconditionally, of someone really wanting to care for us and to nurture us, whether we're good enough or bad enough. Someone who would like to hear the same story from us 25 times. Someone who patiently cares for us and wants what's best for us. A relationship like that is seeded, S-E-E-D, seeded in all of us to desire. Because we were made to be in a relationship with God. Now, the Jewish and the Christian scriptures both teach also that we don't measure up to that moral perfection that God has. As best as we are, as the prophet Isaiah said, our best deeds are like polluted garments before God's purity. As Paul said, quoting the Psalms, there's no one who does a good deed, not even one. Because as Martin Luther said, the best human deed is tainted with at least a little bit of selfishness, which makes it morally impure. I mean, this is the predicament that we're all in. Humans fail to measure up. And then the final point is that God is the one who restores this relationship. And if I had time, I would argue he does it justly, with justice. He doesn't simply say, oh, I love those guys, I'm going to let them off the hook. They're a bunch of immoral buffoons, but let it slide. No, he's got a just way as a just judge and a just God to restore the relationship in a sound, logical, consistent way of fairness. So that's competing views of reality. Now what you've got to do is you've got to assess the evidence. And I want to tell you, the evidence is in the world outside you, but the evidence is also inside you. Because I am convinced everybody in this room is living in that Christian worldview, even if you don't realize it. Living in that Jewish worldview, even if you don't realize it. You may think there's no God, but you still live a life that reflects good and bad. And you still use those terms with meaning. You still care about things. And I'm convinced, see my prop? This is not a real dog. But there are a lot of people who claim to live in a world that simply doesn't exist. The world without God is a fiction. This little animal could tell you, hey, I'm a unicorn, and really believe it's a unicorn. But it's not, it's a dog. Because that's the world where we live. If our view of reality, those big questions, is there a God, is there not a God? If it doesn't align with how we live and how others live and the love we crave and the human relationships we value, if our life doesn't align with our worldview, there's a problem with our worldview. So what's the evidence? I go through this in the book exhaustively. You get the evidence in 3 minutes because all I'm really doing is whetting your appetite, and I've been giving you part of this as we've been going along. But here's the evidence. First, why is justice and fairness important to you? It is. Pastor Brent, I don't know when, but I'm sure your kids at some young age would say to you and your kind wife, it's not fair. Because we learn at an early age that we believe fairness is right. In fact, one of the biggest reasons people give against the existence of God is, well, if there's a God, he's not fair. Why would a child get cancer? Which, I might add, God gets very angry over and didn't design. But that's in the book. You can read about it. But the whole fact that people are asking and expect things to be fair and to be just, look, you take God out of the equation. And what is fair? That doesn't have anything to do with anything. It's not fair that this cosmic space dust landed out here on this dirt clod orbiting a round ball of fire. I used to have a boss, he'd say, life's not fair. That's why it's spelled L-I-F-E instead of F-A-I-R. They'd say life is not fair, and then you die. John Ross is dead, by the way, but I remember his saying. So when you're looking at evidence, just the fact that you want something to be fair and just ought to tell you you've been hardwired some way. When you look at the evidence and you see how uniquely we value humanity over other animal forms. When someone passes away, we don't feast upon their body like we do when the cow dies. Even the atheist doesn't say, well, Granny's gone, but at least we'll eat well tonight. Because we're all hardwired to value humanity. We were made in God's image. We're not fish of the sea that devour each other unconsciously. Why do people seek meaning and significance in life? Hey, you came here. You're listening to this message. Maybe on the internet, maybe on a podcast, maybe live here right now.
I mean, it's possible that you got drug in here. It's possible. But the odds are you're kind of wondering, is there any meaning and significance in life? Because we're hardwired to want that. Don Quixote is in all of us somewhere. We want to dream the impossible dream, fight the unbeatable foe. We find honor and dignity. We support our soldiers who will give their lives for us. And we honor them for that because that's such an incredible deed. This is all evidence. But I'll tell you, even the other side of the coin, the evidence of suffering. Why is there suffering? The fact that it even bothers us, their suffering, tells us we're hardwired for not suffering. We're hardwired to be whole. And when there's suffering, just as Jesus wept over the death of a friend, so we understand that suffering is real and it causes us to weep, and we don't want suffering. And the charge of God to his people is to try and alleviate suffering because we're hardwired for that. In the book, I talk about why I can't see God. I talk about why prayers seem unanswered. I talk about how God meshes with science, that science and God and faith are not opposite ends of a teeter-totter. They're on the same side of the teeter-totter. God gave us science as a tool to fight disease, to fight a fallen world, to harvest better crops, to feed more people, to clothe more people, to shelter more people. Oh, don't get me wrong. Science can be used for destructive means of warfare against Ukrainians, but it can also be used towards a good end, and the purpose of it is a good end. Science does not conflict with God one whit, and I beg you to look at those chapters if you think it might. I had a case one time seeking the truth. I represented 6 people who'd been exposed to water that had 10,000 times the legal level of benzene in it. One of these kids had a benzene-induced leukemia. It's a real sad situation. The other side brought an expert witness to the stand, and the expert witness said, you can have water with 10,000 times the legal level of benzene and you'll be fine. And in my cross-examination, I said to him, sir, you're saying one thing, but your life shows something else to be true. And he said, what do you mean? I said, you and I both know you don't really believe it's okay to drink water with 10,000 times the legal level of benzene. He said, well, absolutely I do. At which point I pulled out a jar of water that had been certified by Rice University's chemistry department as having 10,000 times the legal level of benzene, and I challenged him to drink it on the witness stand in front of the judge, the 12 jurors, and everybody that was paying him $750 an hour to sit there and prevaricate. He would not drink the water. I'm here to tell you that atheism may be a nice mental exercise, but nobody can live consistent with it as a worldview. It's not the way the world is. So I want to pray with you about this and then ask Pastor Jarrett to come up and to finish with an invitation. But would you just join me in a word of prayer? And if you're not a praying person, you don't believe in God, just close your eyes and listen to what I've got to say. Because, Lord, my request to you right now is that you would bring all of us to a point of saying, first, if you're there, please help us understand you. We're willing to set aside any bias and sympathy and prejudice or formed opinion we've already got, and we would love to know your reality if you're there. Speak to our hearts and our minds. And Father, I thank you so much for your love for us that has sought us out and shown yourself in so many ways outside of us, but also internally within us. May we embrace your truth and your love and share it with this world. These are our prayers in your name, Father. Amen.
Thank you for joining us online. We hope today's experience encouraged and challenged you. At Champion Forest, we are passionate about all kinds of people coming to know God, to grow in their relationship with Him and others, and then to go out and make a difference in the world. We would love the opportunity to talk and pray with you. To connect with us, just go to championforest.org/connect. And hey, of course, we can't wait to welcome you on campus in person on one of our locations. We'll see you soon.